Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the CISO Corner podcast. I'm Dane Dittamore with DataBank. Our subject matter expert is, of course, DataBank's very own Chief Information Security Officer, Mark Houpt. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Dane.
Well, today's topic is special security considerations for edge deployments. We'll get to the questions shortly, but first, a little context. We hear plenty of talk about the edge in our industry, and DataBank CEO Raul Martinek has written plenty about this. For our discussion, we're defining edge deployments as any that need to be as close to users as possible, whether it's in a traditional or a modular data center or pod.
That sounds right. The edge can certainly be in a tier 2 market data center like we have at DataBank, or it could be right at the base of a cell tower in a pod in a remote location. That's exactly what we're looking at here.
Okay, so with that, let's get to our questions. In the most simplistic terms, with data being decentralized, managers of data are physically more removed from it. Is that a problem?
I don't believe so. I think that being physically removed from it is part of the idea of securing it, first of all, because you don't want people in there physically bothering the machines as much as you possibly can. The more you bother a machine, the more you tinker with it, as we know in our personal lives, the more you kind of tinker with something, the more it might break. So it's kind of the old adage is, if the servers are sitting there, they're doing their job, they're running constantly 24/7, 365. If it's not broke, why fix it, right? So only go in there and to deal with that. That's first of all. But then, the other aspect is that with the internet as prolific as much as it is out there right now, I think COVID probably really put the nail into this coffin. It showed us that we can remotely work from anywhere. I mean, we can get in our cars and, if our home is in the middle of the country, we can work pretty much anywhere we can gain access to the internet from. So being right up next to the data is not that, and being right up next to the computers, in particular the servers, is not required in this type of environment.
Yeah. So what you're trying to say is we don't need to be server huggers. I think is the term that we've used historically, right?
We do not. And some people are going to have to put down their Linus blanket and realize that they can sit anywhere and they can still be just as effective. And then, when you do need somebody, that's what data centers are for. We have remote hands options where we can go in, we can swap the drive, we could even swap a server if need be, and the tech doesn't need to come into the facility.
Yeah. So what are the special security considerations for an edge deployment or deployments?
That's a great question. That all needs to start with where's the edge and how are you deploying that? So if you're in a tier 2 market data center, if you're in any traditional data center, you're going to have your typical type of requirements. So, we prefer to see a fence, K-rated fencing around the facility. We prefer it to be 24/7 manned by at least NOC personnel, if not also a security guard. And if not that, then we could be mitigated through having alarm systems on that are immediately responded to, and so on and so forth. That's pretty commonplace. That's what we understand. But when you start moving to the real edge, when you put the data center into a pod, and just for visualization, because this is actually reality, we see on trains, we see on the highways with these big shipping containers, the 40 and 53-foot shipping containers are on the back of trucks or on the, slung onto the back of the trains and going across the prairie lands, right? Those pods are actually inside of those types of shipping containers. And you could take that shipping container and place it at the base of a cell tower pretty much anywhere, because what a lot of people don't realize is that high-speed dark fiber goes to those cell towers in preparation for 5G ultra wideband communication from the cell tower. So when you think about security from that pod perspective, number one, you're going to automatically assume that it's unmanned. So you need to think about the fencing that's around it. You need to think about electronic alarms. You need to think about having, as a provider, having relationships with the local county sheriff or the police department who can assist you in responding to any alarm that goes off on a very quick basis, because more than likely with that pod, even the people, the NOC people, the network operating center type people, are probably 30, 40, 50 miles remote from any type of pod. So we have to consider that type of thing, even considering traditional locking mechanisms. Instead of using electronic locks for fear that the power may go down, we may want to go back to the old lock and key type of scenario, where you have to use high strength bolt cutters or something like that in order to get into it and open it, and be very deliberate about trying to get in there. So there's a lot of those types of considerations that we have to take when we are considering the remote or the far end edge deployments.
Right. What about data security? Is it any different in, say, one of those pods as it would be in any other data center? I mean, I would assume there are, firewalls and
Right.
intrusion detection,
Right.
prevention, or whatever. Are those deployed at the edge, or are those deployed kind of somewhere else within the network, or how does that work?
That's a great question. And personally, I would deploy them right there in the pod, at the edge. So, I would probably deploy, and I would, not just probably, I definitely would deploy all of my traditional data center security, logical security type of modules inside the pod. I'd probably add some, or be a little bit more stringent about the deployment. So yes, I would have a DDoS protection tool. I would have intrusion protection systems. I would have my logical tools like file integrity monitoring. I would have a log offloading to a location outside of the pod, so that I can deal with that. Make sure you have CCTV, so you can see what's going on all four corners and above on the pod. But
Yeah.
then I would also add some things to that. So from a physical inside the pod perspective, I would probably put some sort of alarms on the servers or the cages themselves, so that if someone did break in and for whatever reason the pod alarm didn't go off, then I would have an alarm that's on a server that's being moved, or I would have some sort of alert that would tell me when a drive is being removed from a server. Because reality is, regardless where you put these things, they're all servers, and so they have storage arrays, and they have all your traditional types of things. So I would add some things like that, and then of course CCTV inside the pod, so I could see what's going on. And then this is with these pods, that's also where some of your environmental controls, which do fall underneath security at times, become
Right.
more important. I mean, you got this thing sitting outside baking in the sun in some remote location, where you have to consider how to cool that or even heat that, if it's in a mountain location in the middle of the winter, or up in North Dakota in the middle of the winter. You got to think about how to heat that type of pod, because that metal container is either going to get really hot because it has no ambient ventilation, or it's going to get really cold because that steel will get cold from whatever's blowing up against it on the outside. So these are all things that we have to consider with pods.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably as companies think about the edge or whatever their deployments might be, um, they've got to think about things that they have not traditionally thought about before. So that's
Right.
good input.
Mm-hmm.
So many DataBank customers are delivering edge computing, but maybe they don't use that term. In fact, they've told us they don't have an edge computing strategy. Is the terminology important when we or they are discussing their security in this
Yes.
environment?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the terminology is important regardless of whether it's edge computing or not. So one of the very first things, if you've ever been through a speech class, one of the very first things they tell you whenever you are developing a speech is to know your audience. So it's very important for us in the data center industry, myself in particular in the security industry, to know my audience. And I don't mean know the audience from these people are need to know our audience, our terminology inside the data center. I need to know theirs. So if they're in the financial industry, I need to know what they're talking about. It's very common practice, as an example, it's very common practice in the financial industry to have what's called BISOs, or business information security officers. And these folks are subordinate and usually report to the CISO, but are specifically within a business unit to work with that business unit on employing the security that they need within that. If I don't know that term and I don't understand who I'm talking to, I may not be communicating appropriately with them. So yes, we as data center operators need to know our audience and know the terminology that's used and use it appropriately. There are some industries that understand completely what edge computing is. So if we're talking to a cellular provider, if we're talking to a large cloud provider, they're going to know what edge computing is. But if I'm talking to a healthcare industry that's a regional healthcare entity, they probably don't understand what edge computing is. They may call it decentralized computing, or they may call it the traditional cloud computing, or on-prem computing, or something of those types of terms. We need to know in our head what their terms are and how to translate that ourselves.
Yeah, well, that's really good input, and certainly my experience and yours as well is that when someone asks a question about something, we always want to clarify that, understand, so that we're setting the right expectations, right?
Exactly.
And we're both headed towards the right outcome, instead of just saying, "Oh, well, here's a price for this," or
Right.
yeah. So, well, great stuff. Thanks again, Mark. And this has been a fantastic introduction to Edge, and I'm sure that we'll cover this topic again in future podcasts.
Yep, absolutely. It's been my pleasure to be with you. And as you could probably tell, I love talking about data security. I love talking about these types of things and getting involved in it and really teaching and educating other people. So let's keep doing this.
Well, it shows. For those of you who are listening and would like to be notified when the next CISO Corner podcast is released, just click the link below the video, and also you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. So thank you very much. And as usual, stay safe, stay secure, and we'll see you next time.